planes of motion and just kind of how they work. And I know that's super confusing. I'll make a confession here. I actually made a video over that, but I managed to mess it up like 4 times last week. And so I'm going to just give it another shot here. Okay. So this is Jane, plain Jane. She's going to help us out here. So Amy's question was specifically about sagittal plane, but I'm just going to run through all of them and the motions and then talk about the axes as well. So this is sagittal plane, okay? I slide this over Jane here, and it divides Jane into a left half and a right half, or vice versa, actually, on the film there. So motions that you can do on that, I'm just going to do them here. Lift my hands up, shoulder flexion and shoulder extension, finger flexion and extension. See, they move in that same direction as that plane goes. Okay, so the plane doesn't just cut the body into left and right halves. It's like a line or a wall, really, that extends throughout the whole length of your body. And so any movements that you do in the same motion as that wall are considered motions in that plane. So flexion of the shoulder and extension of the shoulder, flexion and extension of the fingers, flexion and extension of the elbow, and any of the other ones listed that move kind of forward to backward are on that sagittal plane. Okay, so partnered with the sagittal plane is always going to be what is called the frontal axis. And it's called the frontal axis because it runs along where there would be the frontal plane. So in order for Jane here to move her shoulder forward and backwards into flexion and extension, if you think about it like an action figure, how they have little pins in their joint that allow you to move it forward and backward, that's what an axis is, okay? So with the sagittal plane, you always have the frontal axis. They always go together. You can't have frontal axis with anything that's not sagittal plane, okay? So the next plane is that frontal plane, and it divides your body into, sorry, Jane, to split you in half here, a front half and a back half, okay? Movements in this plane, okay, so I'm going to pretend that I'm Jane's arm here, okay? Movements in this plane are abduction and adduction, okay? That's the big one. Also lateral flexion, okay? And side bending with your body, bending side to side, are all along this plane. It's in that movement. So the axis for this plane is going to be a sagittal axis. This axis runs along the sagittal plane. So if I'm looking at, I'm going to be Jane's head here, okay? And I'm going to bend my head to the side. I'm moving it along that plane, but there's a point right about here in my neck where all the movement happens. And if you were to pretend like I was an action figure with a little pin, I would need a pin right here in order to do that action. Or if I was doing Jane's shoulder here and I was doing abduction and adduction, we would need a pin right here in our shoulder, or on me, the pin would be right about here to allow me to do that action. I hope that kind of makes sense. And then finally, the final plane is the transverse plane, okay? And this one takes a second to set up. So it divides your body into, if I can get it to pop on there, there you go, a top half, and lifting Jane up here, a bottom half below it, okay? So it divides your body into a top half and a bottom half. So motions that are on that plane are rotation, okay? They're all rotational movements, rotation of your neck, rotation of your trunk, also supination and pronation, because we're thinking about Jane. If Jane was standing in that anatomical position, and I'm just going to show you really quick, you won't be able to hear me because my mic doesn't work that well once I stand up, but I'm going to show you so you can understand it, okay? So anatomical position here, and so I was doing supination and pronation there. And so if you put your hands like this, you're like supination and pronation are not in the transverse plane. But if you stand up in anatomical plane, or anatomical position, I mean, then it will be. So supination and pronation are also considered those. So the axis for those movements, okay, that point where that has to stay still is going to go through that transverse plane, okay? All axes will always go opposite and perpendicular to whatever plane is moving on it, okay? So transverse plane is going to have what's called a vertical axis, which allows that rotation. So once again, if you think about me and I'm Jane's head, I've got this point right about here that runs all the way down through my body as I rotate. And that's the fixed point that allows me to spin. Okay, so I'm just going to run through them super fast again, and that'll be it. Okay, so we've got the sagittal plane. Splits you into left and right halves, but movements along it are movements that go forward and backward along that plane, flexion and extension, and trunk flexion and extension, neck flexion and extension, okay? Any of those movements, okay? The axis for that is going to always go perpendicular to that plane, so it would go through Jane like this. It would, okay, and it's called the frontal axis, or also known as the medial lateral axis, okay? The next one is the frontal plane, which divides the body into front and back halves, okay? The axes for that is going to be perpendicular to it, okay? So this is known as the sagittal axis or the anterior posterior axis. Always goes the opposite direction of whatever plane, okay? The actions that would go along that, once again, mainly are ab and adduction, lateral flexion, okay, of the neck. And then the final one, once again, I'm not going to go through all of it, is because it takes too long, but the one that divides the body into top and bottom halves, that's transverse plane, okay? The axis for that is a vertical axis. That's the only name for this one. And movements are any rotational turning movements, okay? Hope that helps.